What we're talking about is monsters.
Tony ran his life on his grin.
But if you're going to be leader of a political party, you've got to be a monster.
He was a rock band manager and you weren't quite sure whether to trust him or not.
Margaret Thatcher was a monster.
You must be a real
Clement Attlee was a monster.
He can persuade anybody. He can convince anybody.
Harold Macmillan was a monster.
Is this remotely relevant and interesting?
It's very interesting, yeah.
And Tony's a monster.
But he appeared normal.
That is his incredible victory.
Anthony Seldon is one of Britain's leading political historians. He spent the last 18 months interviewing over 500 of the Prime Minister's friends, enemies and colleagues for a book he's writing about Tony Blair.
I think he's such an enigma. I mean, that's one of the core things that fascinates me. I mean, what is he? What drives him? Is it just the desire for power that drives him forward? Why has he taken this country into the biggest war and the most divisive campaign ever in British history? And I think trying to get right inside his mind, and what makes it, I think, doubly fascinating, is that he doesn't really know himself.
Seldon believes that more than any other politician, Blair is the product of key people who've moulded his character, shaped his politics, and fired his ambition. Through looking at these relationships, he hopes to find the real Tony Blair. The first clue to understanding the Tony Blair of today is his relationship with the woman who dominated politics during his formative years as an MP.
Mrs. Thatcher has influenced Tony Blair more than any other British politician. She was not somebody to make compromises. She knew her own mind. She stated it very strongly. And he wanted to be like her. He wanted to be in that mould.
Seldon's on his way to visit a political hostess who was at the heart of Margaret Thatcher's intimate circle and who's now a close friend of Blair. Carla Powell.
Lady Powell?
How very nice to meet you.
Lovely to see you.
Oh, do come in.
Thank you so much.
Come in,
Blair started coming to Carla's salon soon after he became leader of the Labour Party in 1994. Unlike previous Labour leaders, he was happy to hobnob with industrialists, millionaires,
oh God, this is Paul. Giovanna.
and right-wing columnists like Carla's friend and neighbour Paul Johnson.
Well, but when you're with him, you can have a lot of laughs. Marvellous laughs.
It's true.
Blair charmed them all.
The things about Tony Blair as a politician is that he appeals to women. And why do you think that is?
Oh, I'll tell you why. Because it's very easy. First of all, he's direct. He looks at you in the eyes. He doesn't find a threat being with a woman. Obviously, you know, he was extremely, very easily and happily brought up. And he treats them as equals.
Good manners.
Ah, yeah. Absolutely. And one thing that strikes you very much is his fantastic good manners.
Their respect for Blair has grown as they've seen him become more and more like their political heroine, Mrs. T.
In order to become a major statesman and a real leader, you have to take decisions which you know are right, but which people hate you for doing. And so he's come through the fire.
So what else can I say? You have here the Tony Blair Admiration Inc.
Oh, that's so forward these days.
In 1997, Margaret Thatcher was also enamoured with Tony Blair, while being deeply critical of her own successor, John Major. He won't let Britain down, she said of Blair. Her closest advisor was Carla's husband, Charles Powell. Tony Blair chose Charles's younger brother Jonathan to be his chief of staff. And soon after he became Prime Minister, the Powell brothers arranged for Blair to meet Mrs. Thatcher secretly for some advice on foreign affairs.
both of them found those discussions really quite valuable. Tony Blair admired her strong leadership of Britain, which enhanced our position in the world and our role in the world. Part of that, of course, was also a very close relationship with an American president. And both of them have reached the same conclusion, that Britain and America can really change the world if they stand together and act together.
As a young MP, Blair saw Mrs. Thatcher change the face of British politics. 7 years after inheriting her mantle as Prime Minister, she remains his model of how to carry out radical reform. He's even ended up sounding like her.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say.
Forward or back? I can only go one way.
U-turn if you want to.
I've not got a reverse gear.
The ladies not for turning.
I believe Tony Blair does see himself very much as a radical, reforming Prime Minister, and in that concept he certainly resembles and deliberately resembles Margaret Thatcher.
Blair has been in open confrontation with parts of his own party over his determination to pursue what many see as Thatcherite policies: foundation hospitals and top-up fees for students. But above all, it was his decision to go to war against Iraq, which was supported by the Conservatives, including Mrs. Thatcher, which has incurred the wrath of his critics.
He decided it was right, but he gave us a series of half-truths and so on to get us there. And
this has become a profoundly difficult issue for us.
Charging you with war crimes, Mr. Blair! Mr. Blair, I'm charging you with war crimes!
Seldon wants to find out whether Blair is the man of principle he claims to be, or a deluded idealist whose ambition has blinded him to right and wrong. We follow Anthony Seldon on his search to understand Tony Blair.
Thank you.
It takes him to Durham,
Shit.
looking for clues to the formative influences on Blair's early life. His parents, Leo and Hazel. The Blairs lived here in the late 1950s, when Tony went to school in the shadow of the cathedral.
His mother, Hazel, was very religious, and she used to sit with him and they would pray together. She was the person who most gave him Christianity, and that hasn't generally been understood. Indeed, Hazel in his life has been extraordinarily underestimated. She was the rock of Tony Blair's life. She was the person who gave him this boundless self-confidence, this ability to think that he could carry the whole world before him, was because of that extraordinary, constant love that this woman gave him.
Blair's father, Leo, was a barrister who came from a working-class background. By 1963, he'd made enough money to buy this brand-new house in a smart suburb outside Durham.
Sometimes Tony Blair would say, "My dad's Norman Tebbit." What he did was he built his way up from absolutely nothing, aspiring towards being a Tory party candidate and a big player in the bar up here in the northeast of England, and he aspired to a much better standard of living.
In 1964, when Tony Blair was 11, his comfortable childhood was shattered.
My father became ill, and he had a stroke, and all our lives changed after that, really. Well, for the first 24 hours, we weren't sure whether he was going to live or not, so then that was okay, but then when he came back home, he really couldn't do anything, which was very tough for him because he was a public speaker. He was a good public speaker, he was a barrister, he was a good public speaker, so all those things had to stop.
Leo recovered, but couldn't fulfill his hopes to become a Conservative MP. He remained deeply ambitious for his children, however, and when Tony was 13, he sent him away to boarding school in Edinburgh. As Prime Minister, Blair has made it his mission to improve state education.
Education, education, and education.
But Seldon thinks the key to understanding him is the fact that he went to a private school.
Can we go to Fettes, please? Thanks very much.
Fettes was one of Scotland's top public schools.
Nice tartan rug.
You stand on a wondrous sight, like a vast palace, conspicuous everywhere.
So, here we are.
Seldon's come to meet Robert Philp, Blair's house tutor in his early years.
Hello, Robert.
Anthony, very good to see you.
Anthony Seldon. Can you tell me what he was like when he first arrived here?
He was a very straightforward young man at that stage, obviously looking forward to everything that his public school would bring him. But in the latter half of his first year, he was beginning a bit to say, here we are having to do all these jobs and chores, and why should we?
Blair was at Fettes in the 1960s. While the rest of Britain was going through a liberal revolution, the school was stuck in Victorian times.
It was very, very claustrophobic. We played hockey against an approved school, and I remember sitting after we played hockey, talking to these guys, and they were saying, oh, it must be great for you living in Edinburgh, you know, you ought to go up to the pub, you can do all these things. And we said, well, no, we can't do this, we can't go out. And they turned around and said, it sounds like you live in an effing prison. Now, that was coming from kids in a Borstal.
At Fettes, Blair kicked against the system. He showed no interest in putting the world to rights.
Tony Blair doing good for the world as a schoolboy? Absolutely not. He would grin and pout and leer at anybody that asked him to do something that he regarded as trivial. It wasn't a rebellion with anything to replace it. Tony was not a politician of any description at Fettes.
Blair's best friend and fellow rebel at Fettes was a boy called Ewan MacDonald. Along with Nick Ryden, they formed the Awkward Squad with Tony as their spokesman.
Well, one of Tony's skills was, of course, sort of brinksmanship, and he knew how far to push something and then withdraw. He would not push the wall over, if you like. He would just see it wobbling slightly and pull back. He became a master of that.
He was a very noticeable member of his year. Yes, he was.
So what?
He was very noticeable. Well, obviously for being out of line, and also for being a great arguer.
By the time Blair was in the sixth form, the authorities had grown tired of his bolshiness, and he narrowly avoided being expelled. But for all his dislike of Fettes at the time, he's a classic product of the public school system.
I was very lucky in my background, very lucky indeed. I got a decent education. That's one of the reasons I think education is so important.
Fettes nursed Blair's competitive nature and gave him intellectual confidence. But in terms of politics, he was still a blank page.
That's good, that's good.
Tony Blair left school in 1971 with 3 A-levels and a place at Oxford. Seldon's been told most of the staff were glad to see the back of him.
His housemaster, when he left for school, said that he thought he was going to be perhaps destined for a career which was going to be playing in a pop group or maybe an actor. He thought maybe he'd be somebody who would get involved in a hippie or druggy type community. But then he thought again about that, and he thought, no, he thought Blair's just too shrewd and too keen on his own self-preservation, he thought, to let himself get that involved in going down the drains in that way.
So do you remember that Blair walk he used to have?
Yeah, go on.
Blair took a year off before he went to university and spent his time in London promoting a rock band called Jaded.
That's brilliant. I've forgotten that. You know. It's absolutely brilliant. That's exactly how he used to walk too. It's incredible. Really amazing.
Why did he walk that way?
God knows.
This was that wasn't...
No, that was the church. We used to play down here.
Oh, right.
This church crypt, now a drop-in centre for the homeless, is where the band had their gigs.
My memory about Tone and this place really is that after the end of every gig, Tone would come up and say, "Well done, boys. You did really well." So even you remembered that. Even you remembered that. "Well done, boys. You did really well." He did that after every gig, you know. And you got the impression he sort of meant it, but he was slightly sleazy. But at the same time, he seemed fairly genuine as well, you know.
He wasn't content to be the roadie. He had to be the manager. You know, he was the one with the sort of plans to take it on, and that's what he's doing. He's managing the biggest band in the country, which is the country. We're all in Tony Blair's band now.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
Excuse me? The canteen's now closing, and if you want to get something, you better get it now.
Yeah. What? Yeah. All right, fine.
In the autumn of 1972, Tony Blair came to Oxford University to read law. Anthony Seldon was here at the same time.
Oxford in the early and mid-70s was dominated by public school people wearing flared trousers and wearing Afghan coats and having their hair long and going to parties and drinking much too much and staying up half the night and punting on the river and getting involved in plays. It was an extraordinarily unreal place, detached from ordinary life, but immensely, immensely exciting to be part of it.
Seldon's arranged to meet one of Tony Blair's friends at Oxford, the president of a drinking society he belonged to called the Archery Club, Andrew Byrne.
He was a very bright and bubbly, charismatic kind of guy who I think immediately rose to the surface of what's always a very kind of frothy society.
Most of Blair's Oxford acquaintances remember him as a likeable but unfocused young man.
I mean, what was his real thing? Where was his heart?
I think that's really very hard to say. I couldn't say it was anywhere. I mean, he had an interest in music, but you know, when you look back on it, it's quite a dilettante interest in some way, similarly in drama. But for the rest, I think it was just a kind of fairly superficial scouting about.
But Blair's socialising masked a more serious side to his character. We've discovered that during his first year at university, he was touched by a tragedy which marked a turning point in his life. In May 1973, Blair's best friend from Fettes, Ewan MacDonald, killed himself jumping from a bridge in the centre of Edinburgh. Tony Blair was 19 years old when Ewan died.
This was someone we knew. This is someone we'd actually spent 5 years with at boarding school, so we knew Ewan very well. I mean, it was almost like a closer member of the family than our real family because of the way in which we'd been at that school together for so long. It really hit us. It hit Tony very badly. I think it was a wake-up call. You know, despite the long hair and stuff, maybe it was time to review life and what people were doing.
Ewan's death coincided with Blair turning to the Christian beliefs which would later determine his politics.
What happens at Oxford is there's a process whereby he starts to take Christianity seriously. Friends notice, for example, that a Bible suddenly appears by his bedside, that he starts talking about Christianity, he starts going to chapel, he is confirmed. So there's a revolution going on within him.
Crucial to Blair's embracing of Christianity was his friendship with a fellow student called Peter Thompson. Thompson was a left-wing priest, and through him, Blair took the first step towards defining his political outlook.
The idea of your beliefs being something that resulted in action was what, in a sense, he brought to the development of my philosophy. In other words, your religious belief wasn't something that shut you away from the world, but something that meant that you had to go out and act.
He had this passion. It was always present. You know, it wasn't a sort of fad or joining a club or, you know, being part of the debating society or whatever. It was this absolute constant belief in social equality and in justice and in doing the right thing.
In 1975, Tony Blair left university and returned home to Durham. He knew that his mother had been diagnosed with throat cancer, but he didn't know how serious her condition had become.
He'd finished his finals at Oxford, and he arrived back at Durham Station and was met by his father. And his father said, "I'm afraid to say Mum is very ill." And he said, "She's not going to die, is she?" And he said, "Yes, I'm afraid to say that she is." And she died 2 weeks later.
I think when my mother died when I was 21, you got a sense of urgency into your life as a result of that. I mean, do you know what I mean? You suddenly thought, look, it's actually quite a short time you've got, so you better get on, you better get things done, you better do things.
She wrapped him in a blanket, this incredible emotional blanket. And when she died, I think that blanket was suddenly stripped away from him, and it was the cruelest, sharpest blow that he's ever had in his life, because he suddenly realized that the world was a much colder, more dangerous, less happy place than it was when she was there.
Anthony Seldon believes Hazel's premature death galvanized Tony Blair into making something of his life. Three months after she died, Blair arrived in London to start training as a barrister. The next person to enter his world would push him towards embracing the Labour Party and becoming an MP.
But I always remember Cherie being in the Lincoln's Inn Library, and when everyone else would sort of go down to the pub for lunch, she would be sort of eating her sandwiches in there and poring over her books.
But instead of calling her a swot, you thought she was quite interesting.
I did, I thought, and still think she's one of the most unusual and interesting people I've met.
Cherie Booth remains a powerful influence on Tony Blair to this day. She comes from a completely different background to him. She'd had a tough childhood in Liverpool, brought up by her mother, a single parent. Her father is the Labour activist and 70s TV star, Tony Booth.
Here was somebody who he met at a critical juncture in his life just after his mother had died, who was telling him and showing him by her own example that you've got to make the most of your life, you've got to get on, life's short, and you've got these opportunities, and if you blow this week and this month, then it won't come back again. And he was fascinated by her. He was caught up in her web, and he's never been able to, not that he's ever wanted to free himself from the Cherie web.
After 3 years together, Tony and Cherie got married. In 1980, the young couple moved to the London borough of Hackney.
Hackney is showing severe signs of decline. Industries have gone, jobs have been lost. Signs of prosperity are hard to find.
The Blairs joined their local Labour Party, which was split between left and right. Tony and Cherie were part of a small group of successful middle-class members. John Lloyd was another. He witnessed the Tony-Cherie partnership in action.
I think the difference between them remains one of class. So that while she was committed to her background and to, if you like, a kind of general working class advance, Tony was committed to a certain moral idea, a kind of Christian liberal moral attitude that someone blessed with the life chances he was should pay it back. You know, that should give something to the community for his luck. Part of the dynamic of the relationship, you early became aware of that Cherie would tend to be the more radical one, and Tony would be the more considered one.
Both were highly ambitious people. They were people who had risen to the top of the system, and they both were passionate to go into politics, and they both felt somehow that this was their destiny, but not both of them could do it. It makes life very difficult if you're going to have children, and they wanted to have a lot of children, so a choice had to be made. It was either going to be him or it was going to be her. And the key question was who was going to be the first to find that safe seat.
First off the blocks was Tony, who secured the nomination to fight a by-election in Beaconsfield in May 1982.
Tony Blair's press secretary says that he's exactly the kind of young man that any Beaconsfield mother would be delighted to welcome as her daughter's escort to the young Conservative dance. Like all three main candidates, he's the product of public school and Oxford University.
Although it was a safe Tory seat, the publicity of being a by-election candidate was a huge break. Blair even persuaded the leader of the Labour Party to come and support him, left-winger Michael Foot.
I remember Michael Foot said to me, he's a good lad that, and I said yes, but he's on my wing of the party. He's on what you call the right wing of the party. No, he's not, said Michael. I've had a long conversation with him. He's on the left wing of the party.
There's only one Maggie Thatcher!
Despite managing to appeal to both sides of the Labour Party, Tony Blair failed to make an impact on the voters of Beaconsfield. The Tories were on a roll after winning the Falklands War, and Blair lost his deposit. As the 1983 election approached, Cherie's political career caught up with her husband's. She was picked as the candidate for the constituency of Thanet on the Kent coast.
We realised that she was a very intelligent person in her own right, had a depth of understanding which we thought was mature. She was what I call a scrubbed-up girl. She knew what she was about. Get on with it.
During the campaign, Tony turned up to support his wife.
I was trying to explain to Sherry the advantaged areas to go and do some work in and people to contact. I'm afraid Tony kept butting in as though he was the candidate and it wasn't Sherry. And I turned round and I snapped at him. My wife saw what was going to happen because I'd really let loose. And she said, Tony, come on, help me do the washing up. So he landed in the kitchen doing the wiping up for my wife washing up the platters from the meal.
Well, Tony knows what it's like to be Mrs. MP.
It was
ghastly.
It was ghastly. I can't tell you how bad it was.
He didn't enjoy it very much. There was about a 6-month period, no more,
yeah,
when I was a candidate and Tony was still looking for a seat. And so he had to trail behind me.
Probably didn't do him any harm, did it?
It
probably didn't do me any harm, but I certainly at the time felt it didn't do me any good.
With only weeks to go before the election, Blair got an extraordinary break. He heard that the rock-solid Labour constituency of Sedgefield, near his old home in Durham, still hadn't picked his candidate. Cherie encouraged him to go for it. Sedgefield was a mining constituency and was bearing the brunt of the Thatcher government's painful economic reforms.
They started closing the pits, the steelworks,
you know, and all the heavy industry, the shipbuilding around here, and you know, and we didn't have a way out. We didn't have anything to look forward to. When Tony came...
By an incredible stroke of luck, Blair had walked into a Labour constituency where a key group of local activists didn't want a run-of-the-mill left-wing MP. His enthusiasm and lack of political baggage were exactly what appealed to them.
Give Tony his due. He said to us, you get me on the shortlist and I'll win. That's what he said. Our job was to get him on the shortlist. And he said, you get me on the shortlist and I'll knock the socks off them and I'll win.
Blair was a political unknown, but still he managed to persuade the rest of the local party to choose him as their candidate. He was now a shoo-in to become an MP. Meanwhile, Cherie was soldiering on in Thanet, a hopeless seat.
She's the sort of person that sheer delight can come over, and that was what, in fact, came from the corner over there. The knowledge that he got selected and everything was going ahead.
The Blairs' personal and political partnership had reached a crossroads. Tony, not Cherie, would become the MP. Over the coming years, Cherie would keep making sacrifices to support her husband on his rise to the top. On the 9th of June 1983, Tony Blair became the Member of Parliament for Sedgefield, with a majority of 8,000 votes. Nationally, the election was a disaster for the Labour Party.
Thatcher back at number 10.
Mrs. Thatcher's sale of council houses had won over Labour's traditional supporters in the working classes. Labour, on the other hand, wanted to ban the bomb and nationalise the high street banks.
And the congratulations never stopped. At dawn, Mrs. Thatcher greeted almost hysterical crowds in Downing Street, frantically scrambling over one another for a glimpse, a touch of the Prime Minister.
Thank you so much.
When Blair arrived in Westminster, he was just 30 years old. Inexperienced, his political views unformed. Next, Seldon finds out who and what turned him into a formidable political operator, convinced he was the best person to lead his party into power.
Peter says he's happy to have Peter in now. Which is a fantastic office.
Anthony Seldon's come to the House of Commons, where Tony Blair arrived as a new boy in 1983. He's here to meet Peter Mandelson, one of Blair's best friends in politics, even though he's sacked him twice.
Tony Blair is a genuinely nice person. He's a decent person. He's not somebody who has to get on in politics by pushing other people down or out of the way. He's not somebody who feels that he has to advance himself at others' expense. He's not that sort of politician. I think you can divide politicians into givers and takers in politics. And he's a giver.
When Tony Blair came to Westminster, he found a party bitterly divided between left and right. As a novice MP, Blair kept his head down and avoided taking sides.
I don't actually think it's nearly so much a matter of right and left as people make it out. What I do think is that it's a matter of style. The truth is, we live in a different world now. We live in a world where...
Like a lot of people who came in at that time, he didn't know what he'd let himself into. Because the Labour Party was like a snake pit at the time. And this young man, at that time, would not have known how to cope with snake pits. Today, by God, he knows how to cope with snake pits.
The qualities that stood out were those of a clever person, a clear-thinking person, a very articulate person.
Some have credited Peter Mandelson as the man who schooled Blair in the dark arts of politics, his eminence grise.
They don't understand him. They don't understand the relationship that we had. He was not propped up. He was made more effective whilst taking advice from people he trusts.
When allegations are made, as they are, over a widespread area of phone...
Only 17 months after getting elected, Blair was given his first front-bench job.
I think it's very, very important that people understand...
The enthusiastic young Treasury spokesman was spotted by Mandelson, who was then in charge of the Labour Party's PR. He'd been given the task of modernising the party's image to make it more attractive to non-Labour voters.
The world has opened up in the most fascinating way over the last 6 months or a year.
The personable middle-class Blair fitted the bill perfectly, and he became one of Mandelson's star turns on TV.
All we're saying to them is, look, everyone's done their bit. You've got this money in circumstances where you wouldn't have got it but for the famine and but for the work that's been done to try and aid that famine.
He would take an issue and present his and the party's views in what always seemed to be an entirely fresh and original, rather persuasive way. And that's what marked him out and marked the party out, therefore, too, which is why we would use him so much.
Peter Mandelson didn't create Tony Blair. What he did was to give him a huge leg up. He gave him the know-how about how to play this very subtle game of presenting yourself to not just the media, but to your colleagues in the Labour Party, which is almost as tricky. So he was like a midwife.
I think Peter exerts a sort of emotionally controlling influence on Blair. There's a story about a pre-election rally in '97 where Blair was desperately nervous all through that election campaign, I think more than anybody realises. And he was pacing up and down backstage before this rally, rehearsing his speech. And Peter Mandelson came into the room and said, "Tie, Tony, tie," you know, and started adjusting his tie. And it was almost like he was sort of deliberately puncturing Blair's train of thought, but also at the same time wanting Blair to realise, oh, thank God somebody's noticed my tie was wrong, but where would I be without Peter? You know, so at the same time he's undermining his confidence, but also making Blair feel dependent on him.
Mandelson gave Blair support and reassurance. But Blair would never have become leader without the intellectual input of his roommate since his early days in Westminster. Gordon Brown.
I think that the relationship between Gordon Brown and Tony Blair was for quite some time that of master and apprentice. Tony Blair recognised that it was unequal, that he was, I've heard him say that I learned so much from Gordon, that Gordon is a political genius.
Unlike Blair, Brown had been a Labour politician since he was a student. In personality, the two men could not have been more different. Brown lived and breathed politics. Blair had the human touch.
He's able to make you believe that you really matter to him. You would walk down the corridor, and if one of them came out, Tony would, his eyes would light up and he'd say, you know, hey, how you doing, you know, and this was not just me, it was everybody, you know, that he met, you know, the tea lady, anyone, you know. And for that split second, you felt that you were the centre of Tony Blair's world. Now, Gordon would try. He'd come out of his office and he'd be barreling down with all his papers and everything, and he'd sort of go, you know, how you doing? And the doors would crash behind him. And you knew that you could have been standing there naked and he wouldn't have noticed or cared.
The Labour Party say government neglect has created a polluted, congested and run-down country. Gordon Brown, Labour's Treasury spokesman, itemised the opposition's case.
Gordon Brown was talked up as the future leader of his generation when he performed brilliantly, standing in for the shadow Chancellor, John Smith. But Tony Blair was catching up. In 1988, he followed Brown into the senior ranks of the party when he got elected to Labour's shadow cabinet.
Have we got all these questions done?
With Mandelson's blessing, the BBC made a profile of Labour's hot young star.
Oh, be careful.
4 other people are intimately affected by the rise and rise of Tony Blair. His young sons Nicky and Ewan, his wife Cherie and baby Catherine.
Blair believed that to appeal to upwardly mobile families like his own, Labour had to recognise that people wanted better public services, not union power.
The most important insight that Blair had in the 1980s was that Labour had to side with parents and pupils, not teachers, with patients rather than doctors or nurses or hospital unions. It very strongly diverged from the party policy of the time. It was very radical. I mean, people like Blair and Brown were seen as traitors, really.
Oh dear, oh dear. It smelled like it.
In December 1989, Blair got his first chance to put his ideas into action.
None of us have been immune from Thatcherism, and all of us have suffered failures and defeats. And no...
His plans for modernising the party meant distancing Labour from the trade unions, and he did it through the dark art of spin. Blair wanted to drop the party's historic support for the closed shop, a policy which obliged all workers to join a union, and a sacred cow of the left.
I tell you, to ditch principle in that way is a recipe for disaster and should be rejected by this Congress.
Before acting, he turned to Peter Mandelson for advice.
What he always does is say to those closest to him, am I right? Is it a good idea? Is it doable? Will I get away with it? And what will be the consequences if I don't? He constructs an argument which is, when he delivers it, incontestable.
Blair's plan was to exploit the contradiction between the closed shop and a new European ruling that said people should be free to join a union, or not.
The social charter would represent an important advance for British employees who would, for the
Journalists were briefed that this statement meant that, in effect, Blair was going to drop the closed shop.
Build a better future.
Came out of the blue, we had no preparation of any sort. And then all of us got a series of calls, first of all from Peter Mandelson, then from Tony himself, explaining how he had to do it. We understood surely that this was a big negative. To take it any further, to make a row about it, meant, of course, damaging the party's electoral chances in a major way.
Having bounced the unions into a corner, Blair toured the TV studio spelling out the end of the closed shop, whilst anonymous sources briefed the papers that Tony had taken on the union barons and won.
Three tastes of success.
Blair would use these tactics again and again, exploiting the party's fear of a public split to force through the changes he wanted.
It was surprising and rather brave. And I think that it was in that period we see the beginnings of those views forming in people's minds, that perhaps not only is he different, but he's going to end up at the top.
I remember Tony sitting in that chair there, next to the chair I'm sitting in now. Because he, as I say, he used to pop in for chats with me now and again. And I said to Tony, you've got to stop this Gordon and Tony stuff. It's always Gordon and Tony, with you coming second. And you're going to be leader of the Labour Party and Gordon isn't. So you've got to put a stop to it. And Tony said, but Gordon's my friend. And I said, it's great that Gordon's your friend, because friends in this place are very, very rare. But just take into account that you're going to be leader of the Labour Party and he isn't.
And what did he say to that?
Not much.
Blair's leadership ambitions were fueled by his frustration at his colleagues' inability to force through the changes necessary to gain power.
Peter, how's the battleground going?
Well, now, David, there is Cannock in its old colours, and here is the whole battleground in its old colours, nearly all of it blue. These were the seats Mr. Kinnock had to turn red.
He was devastated when, in 1992, the party suffered its fourth consecutive election defeat.
You can see here the measure of Labour's failure, and let's open the door to Downing Street now, and there is John Major, forecast to be...
He once said you did the best speech in the world, and you were 7 yards or 2 swords lengths, whatever it is, away from this person who just laughed at you, because they were in government, and you couldn't do anything about it. And that was soul-destroying.
After 1992, something happened. Something changed. The iron entered his soul. He wanted power,
and was impatient for power, and if the Labour Party as an instrument could not attain power, then the Labour Party would simply have to be changed. It couldn't have been more clear, and he was not going to hang around.
Labour is the party of law and order in Britain today.
Blair became Shadow Home Secretary. His public profile soared when he made Labour tough on criminals for the first time.
The place for these people is out of society until they learn to behave like human beings in our society.
His star had reached new heights, just as the Labour Party was to be turned upside down. Ten years ago, on the 12th of May 1994, John Smith suffered a heart attack and died. His death left his colleagues profoundly shocked.
I think that he will be mourned not just by his family and his close friends and the Labour Party, but throughout the whole of the country, because he would have been a great, great Prime Minister.
But almost immediately, MPs and journalists started to speculate about who Smith's replacement would be.
And this is a cruel place. John hadn't been dead more than a couple of hours, but we moved on already to talk about the succession. And Tony Bevin said to me, "Gerald, who's it going to be?" I said, "Tony, you'll know who it's going to be." And he said, "Tony Blair."
For years, Gordon Brown had considered himself Smith's heir apparent. But Blair's friends were determined that he should stand.
I knew that the big organised battalions around Gordon would try to heavy him out of it, try and talk him out of it, come up with a million reasons why Gordon was a better candidate. I remember very clearly saying to Tony, "Don't let them talk you out of it. You've got to be the candidate. You're the best guy to lead us at the next election, to maximise our chances of winning, so go for it." And he said, "I'm going to."
On the afternoon of John Smith's death, Blair went to see Peter Mandelson, who had assumed that Blair would be loyally supporting their friend, Gordon Brown.
He asked me what my attitude would be to his desire to stand for the leadership. To be honest, I was rather taken aback by his determination to stand, by the sense that it was the right thing for him to do, and not to allow anyone or anything to stand in his way.
Dan, I want to talk to you about Gordon Brown. I've got some very good new thinking about Gordon Brown and the way to do that chapter.
After the meeting with Mandelson, his assistant, Derek Draper, was asked to drive Tony Blair home.
And he turned to me and said, "You know, I always said, Gordon couldn't be leader without a wife and family. I've told him that. I've told him that before, And I was very surprised to hear him say it. And it was at that moment that I realised, well, wow, this is a guy who's talking clearly about, putting the boot in and is convincing. And I realised that it wasn't about convincing me. He'd started the task of convincing himself to do something to someone who he was very close to, and had learnt a lot from. But he was thinking of reasons why, what he was about to do and had in fact begun to do was not really a betrayal, but something that had to be done, and that he'd in fact warned Gordon, that Gordon could only be leader if he had a wife and kids.
His years in Parliament had schooled Blair in the necessary cruelty of politics, but at the same time, he had to square his actions with the idea he had of himself as a fundamentally good man.
If he's going to take the crown, it means there've got to be bodies on the floor, principally Gordon Brown's. But he somehow reconciles this because he feels there's a higher purpose, and that higher purpose is me, Tony Blair, going on and leading the Labour Party and leading them to victory, and there's no one else on earth who can do it as well as I can.
It's better than, you know, Beaujolais or something.
The first polls showed that Blair's fellow Labour MPs, desperate after years in the wilderness, saw him as the candidate most likely to win over Middle England. Reluctantly, Gordon Brown agreed to stand down.
The decision was an agonising one for Mr Brown, as the closeness in their ages means it's unlikely he will ever achieve his own ambition of becoming Labour leader.
Tony Blair was now the runaway candidate. On the 21st of July 1994, Tony Blair became the youngest Labour leader ever. For many in his party, he was an unknown quantity. They had chosen him for one reason and one reason alone. He was the man most likely to end Labour's long exile from power.
You have put your trust in me, and I vow to you I shall repay that trust with unstinting service and dedication to our party and our country. And I shall not rest until once again the destinies of our people and our party are joined together again in victory at the next general election.
But Blair's seizing of the crown would destroy forever the close friendship between him and his fellow moderniser, Gordon Brown. The rift first became obvious when Blair summoned him to a country house hotel to plan Labour's route into power. Seldon's come to Chewton Glen, the place where they met, to talk to the man who arranged the secret strategy planning weekend.
Colin, how are you? Nice to see you.
Are you well?
I'm very well. How was your journey?
Pollster Colin Fisher had been a close ally of the modernisers since the mid-80s. He's never spoken publicly about this night before.
I think the most significant thing was the atmosphere was completely and utterly different from every previous dinner. It was much tenser.
What happened, and did Gordon Brown produce some thoughts?
Yes, but again, as I said, that's not unusual. That's what you'd expect Gordon to do.
Yeah.
But he was more determined and more dogmatic than he had been. It was less that sort of relaxed, let's talk about stuff and argue about stuff meeting that the sort we'd had before, and much more like a business meeting in that sense.
Well, during their fraught negotiations over the leadership, Blair had promised to hand control over economic policy to Gordon Brown.
And Tony Blair at that time was quite happy to cede all these great areas of policy to Gordon Brown.
Yes. Yeah, I don't have any doubts about it. Maybe it's been rewritten subsequently, but at the time, I had no doubt that Tony felt that Gordon knew more, understood more, had a clearer view of those things than he had himself.
But Tony Blair had only temporarily bought off Gordon Brown. The powers he had given his friend and rival would cause him lasting frustrations. In the following years, Blair would turn to new allies to help him transform the Labour Party and assist him in his drive towards power.
I'll see you later. Bye.
One of Blair's most controversial relationships was with his chief spin doctor, Alistair Campbell. Campbell became so close to Blair he was dubbed the real Deputy Prime Minister. But Campbell's determination to control the press and fierce defence of his master's integrity turned him into a liability.
I think Campbell is somebody who is very aggressive and abrasive, mistrusting of the world out there. The press, they're all bastards. They're all there to try and screw this government, screw Tony Blair.
No, sorry. Again, deliberate conflation of two things. You said correct yourself. Correct yourself. It is not the same document. Do you accept that? Which is not the same?
He's a non-drinking, unconventional obsessive.
Excuse me, we're talking about the weapons of mass destruction dossier.
In many ways, he's the much stronger, more forceful, decisive personality. I'm going to try and get behind all that and see if that really is true. Is he this all-powerful, rather sinister, manipulative figure that he's often portrayed as? Has he been worth all the trouble, all the allegations of spin that Blair has never been able to throw off? Is that all Campbell's fault? Overall, has he been a net benefit to Tony Blair, or has he been a detractor? Would he have been better off without him?
Seldon is meeting some of the people who had ringside seats on the relationship.
Hello. Hello, Peter. How are you?
Yeah, good to see you.
Nice.
Journalist Peter Stoddard spent a month in Downing Street shadowing Tony Blair.
What was your sense, having known Alistair for a long time, of Alistair's relationship with the PM?
I think the most important thing, I think which is most neglected, is the extent to which, you know, when everybody's tired and a bit sort of down, or even sometimes when they're not, you know, Alistair was the kind of battery in the radio.
The relationship between them was often based on humour. They're both very funny guys. They did take the mickey out of each other a lot.
Without Tony Blair, this country is doomed. That's what you want.
Very often, if the Prime Minister was in a meeting with journalists, Alistair Campbell would be sitting there with his feet up. He'd be chewing, he'd be doodling, he'd be raising his eyebrows, he'd be sending notes or texting notes to some of the journalists there. He made it quite clear there was no sense of awe about the office of Prime Minister that his friend Tony Blair had.
So how important is your press secretary to...
Not at all.
How important is Alistair Campbell to you?
Of course, I mean, the press secretary is important for the Prime Minister. I mean, it would be odd if he wasn't, I think.
Yeah, but this particular...
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, I like to think I've hired the best in the business. I hope I have, anyway. So, yeah, of course. But, you know, a lot of twaddles talked about it as well.
Campbell had known Blair since the 1980s. As political editor of the Daily Mirror, he saw the cruelty of the media from the inside. He watched its relentless attacks on his close friend Neil Kinnock during the 1992 election. He was as desperate as Blair for a Labour victory.
Alistair Campbell is very, very partisan. He's recently said, I'm Labour, I'm tribal, I'm Campbell. He is a very tribal man.
He interviewed Blair during the 1994 Labour leadership campaign.
Do you think you were tough enough to cope with the sort of media onslaught that Neil Kinnock, for example, had to endure?
I think it comes with the territory, and I'm entirely prepared for it, indeed expect it.
2 months after Blair became leader, he persuaded a reluctant Campbell to become his press secretary. Blair decided that Campbell was the tough man he needed to help him deal with that media onslaught. Campbell set out to win over the tabloid press, particularly The Sun, gearing his stories to their readership. But there was another side of Campbell that Blair exploited.
Tony Blair delegates nastiness, and so he is prepared to have people around him, whether it's Peter Mandelson or Alistair Campbell, who are prepared to do really quite devious things in his name. And he thinks that because he hasn't done them himself, he can carry on being a pretty straight kind of guy.
I think Campbell played the bad cop. I think he played it very well. I think he played it perfectly willingly. I think he liked fights. He liked to take people on.
Now, if you want to get facts...
Is that FT story right or wrong? Can you just
well,
tell us whether it's right or
no,
wrong?
you tell me what you're saying about the FT story.
Well,
the FT story had nothing to do with any of the people who work for Tony Blair.
Blair is not naturally a fighter. He's actually naturally a conciliator.
He is probably, he does see the sort of the nicer side of things, and I maybe look at the darker side of things. I think that may be true. But I don't accept that I was doing the dirty work that he wouldn't do. I didn't do anything that he didn't want me to do.
Blair would do what it took to ensure a Labour victory. In 1995, the party desperately needed money, so Blair enlisted the help of millionaire author Ken Follett. What then happened to Follett shows Blair's willingness to use and discard those around him. While Blair was battling to reform the Labour Party, journalists ran a story that he'd been to dinner with Follett. His wooing of the rich and famous wasn't popular with the unions, whose votes he needed to push his reforms through.
So there you've got, in the middle of all of this high politics, you've got a story appearing of Bambi in Loveyland at Ken Follett's house. So they decided to nuke him.
Stories appeared in the press distancing Blair from the Loveys and Ken Follett in particular. Follett was furious and went to see Blair.
And he said, well, it's not coming from this office. I was gobsmacked. Of course it was coming from the office. I know how the press works. A story like that wouldn't be credited if it didn't come from Tony's office. It was a ludicrous lie. And I said to him, I can't believe you're saying this to me. And he said, I just realized I've got another meeting to go to. We were in his office. And he got up out of his seat and he walked out of his own office, leaving me sitting there in his office. So, I mean, that was... What else could I do?
Follett resigned his post as fundraiser.
That was the most expensive political briefing in history, because when Ken walked away from the party as fundraiser, they lost a very, very valuable asset. I was astonished. It showed that Blair was capable of extreme ruthlessness if necessary. Ken was just got rid of.
Right, here we go.
On the day the 1997 election was called, Campbell delivered what Blair wanted: the backing of the Sun newspaper, which had so undermined Kinnock at the last election.
Tony, I'm a socialist. Who should I vote for? The Labour Party, of course.
Labour was way ahead in the opinion polls, but Blair was pessimistic. He still feared defeat. Journalist Robert Harris was with Blair as the results came in.
10 o'clock and the exit polls came over, BBC and ITV both forecasting a Labour landslide, and Tony Blair said, I don't believe it. What's going on? And he was wandering in and out of the room, and he said, this can't be real.
More often that a politician is greeted like this by the people who happen to be there, but he's now in amongst the circle.
Blair won a huge majority, and with it an extraordinary opportunity to change Britain. But from the moment of victory, he was obsessed with the next election. So he and Campbell took the same approach to the press in government that they'd used in opposition. Nothing was left to chance.
He's their man.
Tony Blair and Cherie process up number 10, apparently being welcomed by all these people delirious that they finally got a Labour government after 18 years. In fact, these people are all party workers or their relatives and friends, and they'd all been issued with special tickets for this event. The original plan was to have them all waving Labour Party flags in Downing Street, and the civil service kicked up a bit about this and said that wouldn't really do, and so they then moved to an alternative plan, which was to have them waving Union Jacks instead.
Campbell, who was in many ways a genius at managing the press and understanding the mindset of journalists. Overall, the influence on Blair was to reinforce Tony Blair's own weakness for tomorrow's headlines, for the way that what he was doing and saying was going to play in the press and with the public, and not allowing Tony Blair the quality time to sit down and think, what's his premiership really going to be about? And I think he should have done more to plan out in detail what he was going to do once he stepped through that door. And he didn't, and he paid for it.
Blair may have been short on detail, but he was big on vision. His vision came from the most important relationship in his life, a relationship Campbell decreed off limits because it didn't play well with the voters. Blair's relationship with God.
It shall be a government rooted in strong values, the values of justice and progress and community, the values that have guided me all my political life.
The values Blair set out on the steps of Downing Street came not from Marx or the founders of the welfare state, but from a much older authority, Almighty God.
Of practical measures in pursuit of noble causes.
Blair is a deeply religious man. He has said he finds solace in prayer.
Religion is the most important single factor, I think, in trying to understand Tony Blair and what he's done as Prime Minister. This idea that he has of God, he first came across at university, and it made him interested in politics. He hadn't been interested in it at all before, and it was the idea of religion with a social purpose in life, that to be fully human meant that you had to exist in relationship to other human beings with some kind of vision or mission to build a better and a more harmonious community.
Socialism, for me, it is a moral purpose to life, a set of values. I'm worth no more than anyone else. I am my brother's keeper. I will not walk by on the other side. That we aren't simply people set in isolation from one another, face to face with eternity, but members of the same family, same community, same human race.
Tony Blair sees Christianity as a tough religion, that it's about hard choices that we all have to make in our lives, and it's ultimately about a choice between doing good or doing evil.
Blair gave his only in-depth interview about his faith in 1996 to Matthew Dancona of the Sunday Telegraph.
It was clear almost immediately that this was something that was very, very dear to him and about which he had thought very deeply and for a very long time. Remember, this is only 2 years after he'd become leader. This was a time when it was routinely claimed that he was someone who had no ideas, who was obsessed by focus groups, who chopped and changed with political winds, and basically would say anything to get into power. So to discover in the course of an afternoon that, in fact, that he had a sort of hinterland of ideas and beliefs about which he was incredibly passionate and about which he had thought very, very hard over the years.
Anthony Seldon thinks this goes to the heart of one of the many mysteries surrounding Tony Blair. How can such a devout Christian committed to a fairer society also be the ruthless politician who had ridden roughshod over those who stood in his way? Seldon believes it is all about the end justifying the means.
If tough decisions have to be taken, nasty decisions, he doesn't really want to know about them, but he will sanction them for the sake of the greater end. The end is Labour winning the general election victory and retaining power, and out of that will come the Tory party, which is corrupt and self-serving, being thrown by the wayside. It will mean Labour continuing in power. He sees that it's, in a sense, a struggle between good and evil. He comes close to saying that the Tories are an evil, self-serving party.
Now he'd finally won power, Blair wanted to restore people's faith in politics after years of Tory sleaze.
The Prime Minister in '97 came to power on the back of an extremely high trust rating. I think trust, and the trust that the British people put in him, he considered to be a fundamental feature of what he had achieved in '97. And building on that trust and not betraying that trust was very much at the heart of what he was trying to do in the early days.
6 months after gaining office, Blair's own integrity came under fire. The press discovered the Labour Party had received £1 million from Formula One boss Bernie Ecclestone. Soon after the donation, Blair reversed a ban on tobacco advertising for the sport. He was adamant that the two were not connected.
I remember him at the heart of the Ecclestone thing saying, you know, the truth is, I absolutely hate having to do it. I loathe and detest the idea that we have to go and ask him for money.
Frankly, you know, to be chased around by a bunch of conservators who've never disclosed any of their donations and who've never returned a donation in their lives is pretty ridiculous.
But are you personally against Prime Minister? How do you explain Bernie Ecclestone's denial today that he offered a second donation?
He doesn't believe that he could act with base motives. He may be deluding himself. I mean, maybe subconsciously there are base motives that he doesn't want to recognise, but he genuinely, sincerely doesn't believe that he acts from base motives, and therefore terribly hurts when people impugn his integrity.
I think he was clear in his own mind that the policy was changed for the right reasons and it was the right policy, and that in his own mind it was not linked to any donation. So I don't think he felt that he needed a sort of huge mea culpa to the country on that basis.
Good afternoon from Chequers, the Prime Minister's country home. I'll be talking to Tony Blair.
But in order to kill off the story, Campbell insisted Blair must admit he had made a mistake.
I read in the newspapers this morning that you're going to apologise during this interview because you got it all wrong. Is that right?
Well, I didn't get it all wrong in relation to the original decision, as I'd be very happy to explain. But it hasn't been handled well, and for that I take full responsibility, and I apologise for that. But I have honestly done what I thought was best for the country all the way through. I'll carry on doing that, and in the end I have to stand at the bar of British public opinion at the next election. And I will do so, not just with a clean conscience, but I will do so, if I've got anything to do with it at all, having delivered and kept every single promise I made. Because I said I would deliver something different, and I can do it. I can do it.
Blair faced one huge stumbling block. The man who believed Blair had cheated him out of the top job.
The rupture in the relationship and the animosity between Blair and Brown is, even in the most lurid accounts that surface, actually understated.
He's doing a bit. He's doing a bit.
Underlying the sort of silence and the false bonhomie, there is a complete breakdown. I mean, there was no trust.
But Blair needed Brown, who he still believed was a political genius. He had handed him control of the economy, and Brown took full advantage.
Once they got into government, things like the independence of the Bank of England, you know, all those sort of major early milestones were things which Gordon basically constructed and landed on Tony Blair's desk. Not that Tony disagreed with them, but he had no say over them, you know.
No, it's worked very well, actually, because it gives you the chance.
This cohabitation could only work so long as Blair could control Brown's resentment at not being Prime Minister.
Over the following years, a huge amount of Tony Blair's time and energy would be spent managing that corrosive and increasingly difficult relationship with Gordon Brown. Things got so bad that at one point, I've been told, Gordon Brown stormed into Tony Blair's study and said, "When are you going to off? I want your job and I want it now."
All Blair's policy initiatives seemed to involve a painful negotiation with Gordon Brown.
What he did for Tony Blair was in fact to detract from a lot of what Tony Blair would have wanted to do as Prime Minister. Take the country into the Euro, Brown blocked it. Improve public services and modernise them, Brown blocked it. At almost every corner and turn, there was Gordon Brown, who was unsympathetic, resisting and positively blocking what Tony Blair had become Prime Minister to achieve. That, I think, was one reason why Tony Blair spent so much of his time on foreign affairs. In that area, at least, there was no Gordon Brown.
In 1999, 2 years after becoming Prime Minister, Blair was to find a new mission abroad, opposing the ethnic cleansing of Kosovo Albanians by Serbian dictator Slobodan Milosevic. NATO launched a bombing campaign, but the expulsions continued. Blair saw the pictures on TV and was horrified. But what should he do? It was the kind of dilemma he'd discussed long ago with Peter Thompson's Christian group in Oxford.
I mean, part of what we asked ourselves over and over again, and certainly Tony Blair more than perhaps most of us, but in this situation, given these circumstances, given these conditions we are seeing and describing, what is the right thing to do? What are we called upon to do? What is our responsibility in this situation? He asked this question over and over again.
Blair sent his International Development Secretary to the Balkans to see what could be done.
And I came back and said to Tony I'd got to talk to him, and that we'd really got to make a stand and that we couldn't allow a partition, and this was very important. And he agreed. I was kind of surprised because he used to be Mr. Pragmatic and go, you know, the easy way, but he did strongly agree, and I was pleased about that.
Blair travelled to America for a NATO summit.
Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
He was now convinced the only way to make Milosevic back down was to threaten ground troops. But most within NATO opposed him, even his friend Bill Clinton. Blair set out to change the president's mind.
This is simply the right thing to do.
Tony Blair was concerned that he had taken a very forward-leaning position on this. A very forward-leaning position on Kosovo. This had to be dealt with. It was an offence to all our ideals, the very purpose for which NATO existed, and we had to deal with it. It was on our continent. And he was out there on the branch, if you like, and Clinton was somewhere back here. And I think he felt exposed. I think he felt exposed.
Anthony Seldon is following in Blair's footsteps. During the crucial summit, Blair travelled to Chicago to make a speech on foreign policy.
The Chicago speech is extraordinarily important because it comes in the middle of a crisis, Kosovo, that engages him in a way that nothing domestically had engaged him. I mean, this is heart and soul stuff. He's right in there, and he's taking huge risks. And out of this comes a notion that, is it ever legitimate for a sovereign state to intervene in the affairs of another sovereign state? And he puzzles this out in his mind. He comes up with the notion of the doctrine of the international community. Now, this is really interesting because, of course, community is one of the big Blair buzzwords. It goes back to Peter Thompson and Oxford. And here it's being extended to the international arena. And yes, it provides a legitimization for countries to intervene in others for humane reasons.
This is, I believe, a just war, based not on any territorial ambitions, but on good, decent values. If we let an evil dictator range unchallenged, we will have to spill infinitely more blood and more treasure to stop him later.
In the speech, Blair singled out two evil dictators the world must stand up to: Slobodan Milosevic and Saddam Hussein. Blair knew what he wanted to do in Kosovo, but he had to find a way to get Clinton to back ground troops. A familiar technique was resurrected in pursuit of a noble end. Stories started to appear in Britain and America that Blair was tough and brave, and that Clinton was a wimp. Clinton was furious and shouted at Blair for an hour over the hotline.
Alistair was tarred with this accusation. Maybe it was him, maybe it was somebody else, maybe a combination of briefers, you never know. But the British had been briefing quite aggressively on this, both before the meeting and after the meeting. And I think in the end it got to the White House. So we had the great explosion. And I was only aware of it because I was tipped off on the phone by Downing Street saying, well, we've had a slightly bumpy row. And then the record came in almost immediately afterwards, and you could see, you could see that, as they say, shit had hit the fan.
Blair finally won his argument and Clinton committed himself to ground troops. Milosevic backed down and agreed to let the Albanians home. A victorious Blair was feted as a hero by the refugees, in a scene choreographed by Campbell and his press department.
They'd already chosen the tent, chosen the family. They were sort of photogenic, the angle was right. Tony changed his clothes, put on a red top, being the Albanian colours. He never wears red. And the picture duly appeared. Now, it went all over the world, and the people of Kosovo were fantastically, saw Tony as their great friend. I mean, they used to chant, NATO, NATO, Tony, Tony. And, lots of them called their children Tony, because they were in desperate straits, and he made a stand for them, and that is great. But he milked it, and maybe that's okay. I mean, that's Tony Blair.
Kosovo had a great impact on Tony Blair because he stood alone within the British government, even within Number 10, a lot of people thought that he was foolish and out on a limb. And to have gone through that solitary experience when he thought at one time his whole premiership could be over because of this, and to have come through it and to have seen himself vindicated, I think gave him huge heart and boosted his self-confidence in a most extraordinary way.
Did you not spend the whole social service budget per night on bombing Kosovo?
Blair was now under fire for not delivering at home, but he was much more confident in facing up to his critics.
As for this rubbish that we took the whole of the social services budget and blew it on Kosovo, first of all, the figures are nonsense. Secondly, I want to tell you this about Kosovo. I think the day that this movement, with its values, when we could do something about it, would walk away from the worst case of ethnic cleansing and racial genocide since World War II, we'd have something to be ashamed of.
Blair's belief that military might can be harnessed for the greater good was to lead him to forge one of the strangest relationships of his premiership with Clinton's successor, the right-wing insular Republican George Bush, and to place his career at risk once again. Anthony Seldon is in America to discover why Tony Blair took the biggest gamble of his political life, joining George W. Bush in battle against Saddam Hussein. Was Blair just Bush's poodle, or did he really believe in the cause? Back at the end of 2000, the big question was how would Bush and Blair get on?
I think there were many, when President Bush was first elected, who thought that we might see a disengagement by America from the international community, that you might see an American isolationism rather than an American interventionism growing. And he, of course, wanted to avoid that. He wanted to engage the president. He wanted to use and harness American strength and power for the good of the rest of the world.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I think Tony Blair, from the beginning, was viewed with some suspicion, simply because anyone who got along that well with Bill Clinton, for some people, was at least under something of a cloud. I don't know anybody who was expecting or predicting the sort of close, almost intimate political partnership that he and President Bush have developed.
Blair has this belief, has this huge self-belief that he can persuade anybody. He can convince anybody.
Oh, he's charmed me many a time. And he can be very persuasive.
With me, when he's sort of been in difficulty and he wants me to stick with him, he just becomes this very friendly human person. And I sort of almost feel a bit protective, you know, but he knows how to play people. My
view was, it's all down to Bush and Blair. If the chemistry works, everything else will work. If chemistry doesn't work, it's going to be a problem. And in the end, as we saw, the chemistry worked from the first 5 minutes.
Question for both of you. There's been a lot said about how different you are as people. Have you already in your talks found something maybe that some personal interest that you have in common, maybe in religion or sport or music?
Well, we both use Colgate toothpaste.
They're going to wonder how you know that, George.
When two men in such important positions are groping together to find some bonds, they're going to have to do better than Colgate toothpaste. And religion was one of the ways that when you talk to President Bush, is one of the ways that you form your connection with him, because it is so important to him as well.
Then on September the 11th, 2001, an event happened that was to take the relationship onto a totally new level.
The planes came from over there and smacked into the Twin Towers here. That day, the 11th of September 2001, was the defining day of Tony Blair's premiership. It didn't only change him, it changed the whole history of Great Britain. He uniquely understood what it meant in terms of a war against terrorism, but also what it would mean to the American people. His great fear was of an immediate, sudden, disproportionate retaliation. He knew that he had to be right up close to America, that he had to guide and shape this young and inexperienced President, George Bush. The whole moment for him was like for Winston Churchill in May 1940. It was as if Tony Blair felt that everything in his life had been leading up to this moment, and that he was uniquely qualified to lead Great Britain forward and to take the right decisions for our country.
A week after 9/11, Tony Blair travelled to America to give moral support to George Bush. But first he came to this New York church for a service to remember the dead.
Canon Krauss, I'm Anthony Seldon.
How do you do? Welcome to St. Thomas Church, Fifth Avenue. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Well, thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Would you like to see some of the church?
I'd love to, yes.
Good.
Yeah.
His office made it exceedingly clear to us at St. Thomas's that this was to be a religious service. It was not to be a political endeavor. It was absolutely to be a religious service, and we were very pleased with that, because that's what we're about.
Around the whole of the world, there is the most profound solidarity. There is the determination to build hope out of tragedy. There is the surging of the human spirit.
Did you think that you were listening to the words of a religious man or just a politician who was moved?
I did not feel I was listening to just a politician. The clergy have some sense about people at worship. We are blessed here to see world leaders with some frequency, and I sit there where I could see the Prime Minister, and I had the feeling that he was at worship.
Your loss we count as our loss. Your struggle we take as our struggle. And I think the spirit that's been showing here in your city is just something remarkable. And it's that spirit that should inspire us to do what we now need to do to see this thing through.
Blair made an emotional gesture to the United States. It made an enormous impact both on public opinion and on President Bush. And a lot of Blair's later subsequent influence on the policy process, I think, originated in that moment where he was so quick off the mark to say, I'm with you, and I'm offering more than just sympathy to the dead. I'm offering the promise of cooperation in action.
You free? Capitol Hill?
Later that day, Bush offered Blair the rare honour of joining him in Congress.
America has no truer friend than Great Britain. So honored the British Prime Minister has crossed an ocean to show his unity with America. Thank you for coming, friend.
After 9/11, he felt that there was a lesson to be learnt. And the lesson was, if you can see a potentially really dangerous issue coming up on the horizon, you didn't wait for it to whack you in the face and then deal with it. You needed to act preemptively.
But preemption for Blair was about more than military action.
This is a moment to seize. The kaleidoscope has been shaken. The pieces are in flux. Soon they will settle again. Before they do, let us reorder this world around us.
Blair saw an opportunity to galvanise the international community to deal with the injustices of the world, from the Middle East to Africa.
The state of Africa is a scar on the conscience of the world. But if the world as a community focused on it, we could heal it. And if we don't, that scar will become deeper and angrier still.
Bush was surrounded by right-wing hawks who weren't interested in saving the world. They wanted to hit out at those they saw as threatening America, specifically Iraq.
America will do what is necessary to ensure our nation's security. We'll be deliberate, yet time is not on our side. I will not wait on events while dangers gather.
That was wonderful.
Blair became locked in a battle with the Hawks to influence the president.
Welcome the Prime Minister.
By the summer of 2002, Bush had told Blair that he was determined to topple Saddam Hussein.
Blair just did not want America to go in and do it on his own. He thought somehow with his unique confidence in his ability to persuade and guide people that he could ensure that if America did it, they'd do it well. They'd go in, they'd do it in a humane way, they would rebuild a better Iraq after it, and that it would be done far better if he was part of it. That's what he was about.
Blair made a secret deal with Bush. If Bush launched a Middle East peace process and asked the UN to back his fight with Saddam Hussein, Blair would be there by his side if it came to war. Blair's job was to persuade the UN.
It was because of Tony Blair's belief in the United Nations that the decision was made to put so much emphasis on the weapons of mass destruction argument for the necessity of overthrowing Saddam, to the exclusion of almost all the other arguments that, from the point of view of many people here in Washington, were much more important.
By February 2003, Blair had failed to convince the UN, and he was under siege at home and abroad. His MPs were in revolt. The most popular Prime Minister since polls began suffered the largest demonstration in the history of this country. Blair met an old school friend the night before the march.
So he was very worried, because what was going on outside really was pressure at its worst. You could not go anywhere, the protests were everywhere, and life was really pretty bad. But he was clear in his views and clear in his mind, and was able to drop discussing that, or not discussing any great detail, but we were able to have a perfectly normal conversation about numerous other things that, it had not sort of frazzled him to any great extent. Okay, he was worried, he was not sleeping very well, as we know, he was looking haggard and tired, but anybody would in that situation.
I do not seek unpopularity as a badge of honor. But sometimes it is the price of leadership, and it is the cost of conviction. Ridding the world of Saddam would be an act of humanity. It is leaving him there that is inhumane.
My name is Seldon.
Anthony Seldon now believes that Blair was utterly certain he was morally right.
He was convinced that Saddam has weapons of mass destruction. No doubt at all in his mind about that. He saw Saddam Hussein as an evil person, evil.
Blair toured the TV studios trying to persuade the public of the rightness of his cause.
I lost my only child in the World Trade Center. Now, for the last 18 months, my pain has been unbearable. I can't describe to you how I feel and how I will feel to the rest of my life. And as far as I'm concerned, Mr. Blair, your attack in Iraq with George Bush, and it's not dissimilar to what Bin Laden or the Al-Qaeda network done to America. They killed 3,000 or more innocent victims. How many innocent victims are you going to kill, and how many people is going to suffer like I've suffered?
But on the
No, Mr. Blair, don't do it.
Well, when we took action in respect of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, whenever you take military action, it is true that innocent people die as well as guilty ones, but sometimes you have to take that action if it's the only way of dealing with the threat that is there.
Journalist Peter Stoddard spent 30 days inside Downing Street in the run-up to the Iraq War.
I asked him, how do you feel morally about the children who are dying as a result of your actions, regardless of whether those actions are right or wrong or well or badly conceived. Nonetheless, if you order a bomb to be dropped and it kills someone, you have some moral responsibility for that, however good an end you're trying to achieve by that bomb. And he said, yes, that he was prepared to meet his maker, to justify his actions. And I think it does give a high degree of personal strength to someone to face up to the extraordinary pressure that he was under, to say that there was a judge for him beyond Alistair Campbell and the gang, beyond Labour MPs, beyond the country at large, that he was prepared to be judged by his maker.
Blair had promised Parliament a vote on military action. If he couldn't get a majority of Labour MPs to back him, he decided to resign. Then the negotiations in the UN finally collapsed, and Blair was facing disaster. Bush even offered him an escape route, as he confided to an old friend.
And Bush had said to him, I mean, I don't think many people realise this, and I think it's to Bush's credit in one way. Bush had said, if you think it's not worth losing everything, we'll do it ourselves. And Tony said, you don't change your views like that in 2 seconds. It's either right or it's wrong. And it's right for us to be involved in this against terror.
Former Bush advisers believe if Blair had spoken out then against the president, the war might never have happened.
He is a very large figure in American life and American politics. And certainly, a lot of your power in politics is your potential power, which is, say, what would happen if you were ever to go public with a disagreement? And Tony Blair's potential power is huge.
Why do Americans admire Tony Blair so much?
They love Tony Blair. They think he's their friend, and they really love him, and I do too. I think he's a great person.
Well, I would say he just sort of has a charming persona, and the American people are suckers for that kind of thing.
Well, I think of Tony Blair as someone who actually is very articulate and very intelligent.
The most popular Prime Minister with Americans since Mrs. Thatcher, more than Mrs. Thatcher? Is he like Churchill?
Even more so, I think.
More so than Churchill?
Yes.
If Tony Blair had gone public and said there's no longer a reason to go to war, I think that may well have put George Bush in an untenable position. So there, by what he didn't do, if you will, he may have had a tremendous or fundamental impact on the course of history.
Back in Britain, Blair still had to win the vote in the Commons.
The most striking thing to me was that the Labour MPs, for instance, who were coming in to be lobbied about the war, they had a view of Tony Blair which was several years out of date. I mean, they just saw him as an election-winning machine. You know, they didn't like him very much, didn't agree with him a load of things, but he won elections for them. That was his job, that was his purpose. He saw that was his purpose. Thank you very much. Along the way, Tony Blair had made some decisions.
Are you being reckless, Prime Minister?
About the world, even before 9/11, about himself, you know, what he wanted to do to that world and that he was in a hurry to do it, which nobody had really noticed. But when I was there, being with him all the time, it was absolutely clear you had a tougher-skinned, generally harder man.
When Blair finally spoke to the Commons on March the 18th, he was fighting for his political life. He had asked his civil servants to prepare his resignation papers.
This is the time for this House, not just this government or indeed this Prime Minister, but for this House to give a lead. To show that we will stand up for what we know to be right. To show that we will confront the tyrannies and dictatorships and terrorists who put our way of life at risk. To show at the moment of decision that we have the courage to do the right thing. I beg to move the motion.
Blair won the day, but in so many ways, his victory has turned to ashes.
Near the outskirts of Baghdad, American vehicles burn.
There will now be an inquiry into why no weapons of mass destruction have been found in Iraq.
Police in Wantage confirmed that Dr. Kelly's death had been suicide.
Have you got blood on your hands, Prime Minister? Are you going to resign over this?
Politicians are now openly questioning whether Blair can hold on as Prime Minister. Time's running out for Seldon too, as he tries to work out what Blair has become.
What's happened to Tony Blair is that he was just this very ambitious but unformed human mass, and that the people he met along the way have shaped him, shaped his thinking, they've helped inform his Christianity, everything, and that one by one, as he's gone throughout his career, he's dropped those people as they no longer have had any further use or purpose to him. At the end of the day, here in 2004, at the end or close to it, he is left with just two core relationships. One with Cherie, his wife, and the other with God, his maker.
Blair's Christianity guided him into politics to help build a fairer society.
These are the vows that I make to my country. I vow that we will have cut the numbers of long-term unemployed. I vow that the promises that we make on tax, we will keep. I vow that we will have built a new and constructive relationship in Europe.
But in recent months, he's barely been able to get his policies past his own party, and may have permanently lost the public's trust.
There's a big job of work still to do, and my appetite for doing it is undiminished.
Keep in touch. Bye.
Seldon believes Blair has squandered his opportunity to bring about the radical change he longed for.
I think the tragedy of Tony Blair is that it was when he thought that he was being his most morally right that he made his fundamental error, which has undone his second term in politics and undone his entire premiership. When the epitaph is written on Tony Blair's grave, there'll be the word Iraq.
In the end, I have to stand at the bar of British public opinion at the next election. And I will do so, not just with a clean conscience, but I will do so if I've got anything to do with it at all, having delivered and kept every single promise I made. Because I said I would deliver something different, and I can do it. I can do it.